here is essentially the final portion of this jatos study guide. So we've gone through our sort conditions. All of our HTML code is coherent. It's doing what we want. Ideally, we've run through this a couple of times. We've also run these components individually to make sure, there's no errors. Sometimes that's as simple as just clicking on them, seeing if things load, and you can maybe assume they run from there. I've done a sufficient amount of debugging and testing for these to be pretty confident that there's not going to be any errors. We also, want to check how the data is uploaded, so we can go into our results files here and see that these are my test ones, but I've essentially done these and made sure, that I am getting the data that I expect to get here. So when I'm happy with this experiment and the way that it's running, I am going to export this so I can finally move from my local version. I hit export here. I'm going to save this to eventually the server version. Now, I've already done this. The export for this, it's only 5-6 megabytes, doesn't take particularly long time. And these, end up being a JZip file, which is just a compressed zip file. If you ever needed to open this up and, change it, you can just rename this to a zip file. I'm pretty sure they just, and then it will uncompress normally. They just name it that. So for whatever jatos regions they do, but all of your data is still here in the exact same format. So here's the one that I just exported. And now, if we look up here, I'm in my this IP address. I'm not in my local jatos anymore. I'm in my online version. One thing, perhaps a little silly here, but you can always distinguish these because the jatos local has a black background behind its header bar. Not the most distinctive characteristic. The online version doesn't have that, but just so you know, if you're in your local jatos versus your online jatos, you will see that difference, and you can use that to be aware of it. Now, I have a previous version of this study online. This is my server version. Here's the old one. It just had those two conditions, right? Back when we just had our two condition counts here. And actually, if I go into this worker and batch manager, you can see that there's a bunch of different batches. I ran a pilot batch. I ran the sort of first version here, and then I have a new version that I'm planning to run for spring 2021, which has not been initialized yet, so there's no batch session data here. But if I go back to this one, 140, right, I can actually just see here that I did have quite a few of these running in whatever conditions there were available at the time. So sometimes when I'm planning to upload a new study, I've already saved this data. I might actually just end up deleting this study because, this is when uploading, you don't want any potential errors to take place, and sometimes it's going to overwrite things, and it's going, because these have the same name, it's going to ask me to overwrite, and it's going to keep a lot of this previous information from my active batches. I don't really want that here, so typically I might delete it, but I think for the purposes of education, it would make, when that happens here, you go into more, you delete your study, it's going to give you a question on whether or not to do that. But for now, I'm going to upload it, and we're going to see how that's done and basically what happens in the jatos system. So I hit import study. That same one that I've exported before is right here, or rather this one, in that JZip format. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK here. Sometimes this might take a little while. It's a fairly small study, and I'm on a Ethernet connection, so I'm hoping it's only going to take about a minute. But perhaps while that's happening, we don't have to stay on this window. I'll jump over into the UC Sona page here. So while that's going on, I've logged into our research portal page. And for my studies here, I'm going to sort of start. This study is already active, so I'm not actually going to create a new one from scratch, but I'm just going to view and edit my study. So for this study, the item is somewhere on here. These ones are all called online. Online team word recognition with an artificial agent. I'm going to click into study info here. and here's all of my information. If I hit view study website, you can see in that bottom left area of the window the IP address that actually relates to or links to the batch for this experiment. I'm going to go in here, and I don't actually need to probably change this study information right now, but I'm going to open this up. This is where I'm eventually going to put in the IP address, right, over here for my specific study in jatos. So jumping back over, I can see that my upload is finished. Here's what happens when we have two studies that have the same name, or actually what they have is the same study assets directory. So inside of that local folder that you have, the local folder name is the same. So when it's uploading to the server, it recognizes those are a duplicate and it knows it's going to overwrite. So I want this to be overwrited. It's going to change it's going to overwrite the components, right? And here's what would happen here. So components not included in the imported study. Basically, anywhere where there's an HTML file that HTML path is associated with a component name, they're going to turn inactive, but they're not going to get deleted. So this sort of ends up, in my opinion, making the study a little bit messy. We're going to do it for now. This is why I would typically just delete. So I overwrote it. It says the properties of this other study were overwritten, but anyway, here's my new study exactly as it would look in more or less exactly how it would look in my local version, right? Components 1 through 17 that I have here, it's my online version, and components 1 through 17 here that I have in my local version. So what we can see is since I did that overwrite, it kept these other components that I don't really need right now. They're still there with their server equivalents where they're hosted on the server there. They all get moved to the end, so I don't need to do anything with these. They're inactive. They're not going to do anything when I run the study. I'll just leave them here for now. Typically, though, I would delete those components. It's usually just easier for me to make sure that there's no mistakes when there's not, extra components floating around. But this is done. This is now essentially imported onto the online study. So now what I can do is I can go into a new, create a new batch and set that up in my Sona system. One thing to always check here is that my sort conditions, which overwrote this, has my correct condition counts. So this JSON input is saved. So the JSON input is saved. Here's my new conditions, all 12 of them with 50 in each. But if I go into my batch session data, this is where there's sort of that distinction between what's happening with your HTML files, what gets uploaded to your server, and then sort of what's already present there. Nothing in this batch session data is going to have changed. So if I go back to this pilot batch, you can see I still have my 140 results. Those aren't deleted or anything. I only have these conditions A, B, C, D, and whichever ones I had here previously, right? Like I should have 600 of these. Other than if this was a new session, I would have completely different numbers here, but I don't have those here. I don't have any of my conditions J, K, and L, those latter ones that are in there, because this session data is not going to be reinitialized. Once there's information here, that code from sort conditions isn't going to, overwrite this unless it's a new session with no information in here. So that's just another thing to be aware of when you are starting a new study or overwriting a study. Now, I'm going to end up running a new batch. I actually already have this one set up. It's this spring 2021, for which there is no batch session data. So once someone has run through this initially, once they've hit that sort condition HTML file, that component will generate this data. So if I didn't want to do that, I can actually just delete this. I'll delete it now as an example. It's not going to do anything. There's no real results in there. I'm going to create a new batch, surprise, surprise, calling it Spring 2021. And now we can see it's here. The batch session data, which is already empty, is still empty. But I'm going to enable the worker types here, general single and general multiple worker. And then I'm going to get a link for a general single worker. Now this worker type, you can see the description here, means that each IP address, or really each sort of unique browser IP for a participant, is only going to be allowed to go through once. And this seems like the smartest way to run your study, except that participants occasionally will accidentally close a window. They will hit refresh, they'll click the study link, they'll close it, they'll open it up again, and they will get that IP address will basically get recorded, and then they can't access the experiment again. So it's usually much easier just to do the general multiple worker, which doesn't block an IP address that has shown up before. Now, participants, at least in our experimental setup, are still limited to one participation, one time going through this study, essentially because they can only sign up for it once in Sona. So that's the version I'm going to use. You can try out different versions. Your results may vary. One thing that I tend to do is, these are not activated here, but I'll often have like a personal single worker one here. So if a participant has an error, they let you know, they send you an email. I'll generate a link here, and this with a comment, let's say something like the date. So 4/22 was maybe when an error occurred, and CTA, just to let anyone else who looks in here know that I'm the one who generated this link, and I can send a personal link with a specific worker ID to a participant that's had an error, and then I can track that they've actually made it through the system and award them credits accordingly. So for now, I still have that link. So I hit the get link button here for the general multiple worker type. This is copied, and then I go into my Sona code. So I'm going to paste this. You can see it was already a general multiple link for this previous version, but you're going to see the batch ID here change. So paste that in. Batch ID is 163. I have a new batch now, so there's a new number here, and that's going to direct any participant who goes through there, right, to our IP site, to the correct batch and then to the correct worker type. So that's the only thing that changes on the Sona end. Once this link is in there, when a participant signs up for the study, they're going to get that link, they're going to click into it, and they're going to immediately be sent into the system. So I'll go ahead and save that. Don't know what that error was, but I'm pretty sure it's probably fine. If I hover over View Study Website in the bottom left corner here, we're going to see that my batch ID 163 is the correct one. I can actually click on this, and it's going to send me right to the consent page. So this is where I want to go, right? This is the experiment set up. Here's our description, our updated consent sheet with our research information. Participants, if they click here, it's going to download the consent document. And then they enter in just some identification information. This is just for reference. In case they have an error, we can go in and sort of try and find their data. If they have an error early on, this doesn't even get saved, or if they abort the study, this doesn't get saved. So, just one way to kind of tag studies with data that's essentially anonymous and would help us identify a participant if they then supplied us with the M number in an email requesting help. So I'm not actually going to click through here, but this would take me into the sort conditions page, or and if I hit the continue button here, this would actually create that batch session data, I believe. So I'm going to close that out for now. And then the next video is just going to cover exclusively in Sona creating slots that correspond to how many participants